Hi, everybody. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. It's a free agency frenzy edition of Kindred Skulls. We've had a ton of Vikings movement over the past week since we last recorded. Nick, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Happy St. Patty's Day, belated St. Patty's Day to probably all of our listeners at this point. But unlike you, Matt, I'm wearing green, so I'm virtually pinching you right now. But yeah, I mean we got a lot to cover. We've got like a list of half the roster pretty much on our list of things to hit today. So it's a completely new team. That Kwesi and Briz and everybody took an axe, and so they're finally reshaping things in Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell's vision. So we're starting to see how it all comes together, which involves a lot of painful ends of some Vikings legends, but also some starts to some new beginnings and a lot of exciting free agents. So it'll be fun diving into it all.
Yeah, in my defense, I did wear green into the office today, so I got that in. I just changed the shirt after I got home, so there we
There you
go.
go.
But yeah, let's jump in because we've got a lot to cover. It's been a really busy cycle, so we know we tend to run long when we have a lot of things to talk about. We want to kind of keep it moving as much as we can here for you guys. First thing to cover, probably top line item, because last episode we caught the Eric Kendricks cut, is Adam Thielen getting released by the Vikings. The writing was kind of on the wall for this since the season had ended. Obviously, his wife's Instagram stories have been a little bit passive aggressive and kind of hinting at it, but also, just based on the contract, right? He had a $19 million salary cap hit this year based on all of the wide receiver market, right? The wide receiver market is very thin. Adam Thielen probably will slot in at a pretty significant value. It was hard to justify him taking a pay cut that he would have needed to save the Vikings a lot of money. So the cut saved the Vikings $6.5 million in cap space. It was before free agency began. It was not a post June 1st cut, which post June 1st cuts do save the Vikings more, but I think there are two problems with them. One, they don't help you get cap compliant because they have to occur after the league year to count. And two, they you don't get the money back until after post June 1st. So for me, a post June 1st cut only really applies where you simply can't sustain a cap hit from cutting a player that season. Like if it accelerates to be a ton of money that season, like that's where the problem lies for me, and that's where you want to use a post June 1st cut to spread it over multiple years. In Thielen's case, we were saving money by cutting him pre June 1st. I think it makes sense to do it that way. Now, past the technical aspect, obviously, like for being a Vikings fan, losing Adam Thielen just sucks, right? It's like he's the homegrown hometown kid, went to where the Vikings literally had training camp, has the story where he paid $500 to participate in the combine, was at, I don't know, was selling dental equipment or had an interview to sell dental equipment and was like, guys, I need to wait to accept a job for the weekend because I have a tryout with the Minnesota Vikings. Just an awesome story, ascended to being one of the best receivers in the league, one of the most productive receivers over, a 3-year stretch, probably from 2016 to 2018. Really just a great Viking, and it hurts to see him go. But from a monetary perspective, I think the Vikings' hands were kind of forced by the contract that Thielen had.
Yeah, interesting. Sad to see him go. I feel like he retires as arguably the third best Vikings wide receiver in Vikings history, which is, nobody's touching Moss, and Carter as a Hall of Fame wide receiver, I think is firmly as number two. And there have been some other great ones. Anthony Carter, you could argue Jake Reed had a long run. And Diggs had his moments, and Justin Jefferson will probably finish as the third best, if not higher. But yeah, Thielen, one of the all-time great Vikings, probably a League of Honor inductee eventually. Tough for things to end this way. Tough for things to end the way they did last year, where it's kind of you could see some tread on the tire, him getting long in the tooth. He's still a free agent, so it'll be interesting to see where Thielen ultimately lands. It'll be interesting to see the contract that Thielen eventually gets, and thinking about like what the Vikings have paid that. But yeah, I feel like I mean we'll talk a little bit about the offense. I think is going to look a little different based on the new skill players that they brought in, but it's tough to see him go. But also at the same time, this is they're trying to get younger, and they cut a lot of older veterans, and the free agents they signed are generally on the very young side, even compared to the other free agents being signed. So I think it makes sense. It's tough, but and I feel like as much as we might critique Thielen and I'm not sure I necessarily would have. would have done the same thing, because I feel like Thielen he's still a solid wide receiver. I'm not saying he's just a guy at this point. He still has some stuff left in the tank for him. So I think it makes the team worse to not have Adam Thielen, to have your wide receiver 2 now be KJ Osborne, to have your wide receiver 3 now be Jalen Reagor. But or if you hope you see something from some of the other young guys. But we'll have to see it first. But yeah, tough. Sentimental loss for the Vikings, but from the cap sense, I do think it makes sense. So, end of an era.
Yeah. So for Thielen, for me, like you said, Nick, I think Thielen still provided value to the Vikings last year. Obviously, he was not peak, a second team All Pro. He got one season, right? Obviously, he was not at that level, and he slowed down. But he still created consistent separation throughout the course of the season. Like, you could put together montages of him creating separation and not getting targeted, because guess what? Justin Jefferson was also open on the other side of the field, right? Like, so at some point, it really does hurt your team to lose him. And I would say the same for Eric Kendricks. I don't think either player is completely washed. I was having people tell me that the Vikings could have signed somebody off the street and had them play in 2022, Geez, I said 2013 there at first. But in 2022, and outperform what Thielen and Kendricks did. And that's simply not true for either player. So on Thielen, when we wrap it up, why don't you go ahead and give us your best Thielen moment from his time as a Viking? Like, what's your favorite memory from him?
Oh man, there's so many. You're putting me on the spot here.
I know.
I remember there was a catch against the Packers before he really broke out, where it was just an amazing sideline toe tap. There was that Cardinals touchdown he had that was like front pylon, was an amazing catch and throw. Definitely the special teams touchdown when he was first starting out. Yeah. That's when that might be my favorite, because that was like, oh, like what a cool story. Like the hometown kid who's just all heart, makes a special teams play and is able to like throw the ball into his stands to his like Minnesota State like sweetheart or whatever. It's like, what a sweet story. And then he goes on to become an all-pro player. So I remember thinking that, seeing that story and being like, that, man, that's a cool story. And I had no idea like how many more great things Thielen had ahead of him. So I don't know. How about you?
Yeah, so mine is actually, and it's kind of a story that came out after the fact, but in the Minneapolis Miracle game, Thielen actually had a fractured back. He sustained a fractured back throw from a hit he took making a catch in the game. And if you remember that game, he made so many ridiculous tight window catches. And that was what the 2017 season was, right? Case Keenum throwing the ball up and Thielen and Diggs making ridiculous catches. But he played through that game in probably a tremendous amount of pain and still made incredibly tough contested catches. Like, he was a significant contributor to that game. Obviously, Diggs has the walk-off touchdown, Minneapolis Miracle, that's ingrained into all of our brains. But Thielen, deserves a ton of credit for his grit throughout that game. And I think that embodies him as a player and his story too, right? So that's kind of why I love that.
Yeah. There's a great NFL film segment he did with Brian Baldinger where like Baldinger shows one of the catches he made, and he was like, I actually broke my back on this play. Yeah. And I got taken out for a play, but then I went back in, and Baldy's like, you broke your back? And he went back in, and Thielen was like, yeah, they weren't like important bones.
And the incredulity is coming from a guy who has a finger which is sideways. Like, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, Baldy's a tough guy too, yeah. So that's saying something. But Vikings legend. So lots of great memories, man. Tough to see him go.
Yeah, so let's move on to Kendricks. We've already lamented the Kendricks cut, but he did get a new contract. It's 2 years, $13.25 million, and he got a $5.5 million signing bonus, right? So it's a significant amount of money in year one that Kendricks is getting on that contract. It's not just a fake second year with an escalated cap hit, which we'll get to that contract structure later when we talk about some of the Viking signings. But as we, looking at Kendricks, I think that given what we probably offered him as a pay cut, this is more money than what we would have offered him to stay as a Viking if we offered him for a pay cut. So it makes sense to me that he would have said, okay, release me and I'll see what I can get on the open market. So I think Kendricks is definitely worth the contract for the Chargers, but I also understand from the Vikings perspective, freeing up the $9 million in cap space that they ended up freeing up.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. In conjunction with the Jordan Hicks restructure, I don't love the decision to restructure Jordan Smith and keep him rather and let Kendricks walk. I feel like, to me, they saved 1.5 million, but they basically gave Hicks a 1.5 million dollar pay cut. So now his salary is just 3.5 million. And then they released Eric Kendricks saving 9.5 million. So there's a $6 million difference between those players. But I also think like there's a $6 million difference in their skill on the field. So especially with Brian Flores' emphasis on man coverage, we've already seen, the Vikings ran I think, the second or third least man coverage last year, and we still saw Hicks get exposed regularly when he had to cover, running backs and everything. So I don't love the decision to prioritize Hicks or to pencil in Hicks and Asamoah as the starters. That said, I do understand from a run fits perspective and from the body types that Flores likes having bigger linebackers. I can totally understand moving on from Kendricks, and it's hard to say no when there are a lot of there was a lot of like blood from a stone type moves here, like restructuring Ross Blacklock to the vet minimum to save like $700,000. When you're doing all 20 of those and you can save $9.5 million off the top just releasing Kendricks with no guaranteed money, I get why they did it. I still don't. I think it makes them a worse team, but I get why they did it.
Yeah. So the next move that that a former Viking made was Dalvin Tomlinson signing a very significant contract with the Browns, 4 years, $57 million is that deal. That's almost $15 million a deal. I mean, I think we talked about it on this podcast. Like, I would have been very good with bringing Dalvin Tomlinson back at around $10 million a year, but I think the Vikings just got priced out of this market. And the interior defensive line, the defensive tackle market was really probably the strongest market that we saw, especially initially in free agency. You had Javon Hargrave get a massive deal. And I think Deron Payne from Washington, he was on the franchise tag, but he got a huge deal as well. So that market did very well for themselves and is great for Dalvin Tomlinson. I mean, I think this is awesome for him. He gets a ton of money, but it's sad to see that he won't be a Viking.
Yeah, I mean, Draymond Jones got over 17 million. Zach Allen got over $15 million a year. So I think part of that is it was a weak interior defensive line class, especially after Hargrave got locked up early and Payne signed his franchise tag. But yeah, I mean, Tomlinson was arguably our defensive MVP for stretches of last year, and he's a really good player. But at the same time, he's a 29-year-old nose guard. Nose guard is one of the positions most liable to get injured, especially as they get older. I completely understand not wanting to invest $15 million a year into a 29-year-old nose tackle, especially when you already have Tonga. You have a defensive line coach who's shown he can find diamonds in the rough from out of nowhere. So it immediately creates a big hole on the interior defensive line. We'll get into how they address that. They've kind of filled a need already a little bit. Does make the team worse, but I would definitely not have signed him to a 4-year, $57 million contract. That's way too much. As much as I love Tomlinson, that's too much money to give to a guy who's on the back end of his career and has had some injury struggles and he's phenomenal as a run defender, but he's not like a difference maker as a pass rusher. So if I'm going to give $15+ million to an interior defensive lineman, he has to give more pass rush than what Tomlinson did, which is not nothing, but is certainly a far cry from the Aaron Donalds of the world. So I get it.
Yeah. So the next move is Patrick Peterson signing with the Pittsburgh Steelers. 2 years, $14 million with $6 million guaranteed on that contract. Another example, I think, along with Dalvin Tomlinson, of a player just being priced out of the Vikings market, given that he was a free agent. I mean, Patrick Peterson, in his 2 contracts in the Vikings, made $8 million in 2021, and he made $4.3 million basically last season. Now he's making $7 million a year for the Steelers. I would have been happy to bring Pat Pete back on the contract that he got last year. I don't love his scheme fit with Brian Flores at this point in his career, right? I don't love him as a lockdown man coverage corner, but I think he's veteran savvy enough that he would have been fine in the system, right? He would have been an acceptable player. However, for the money that the Steelers gave him, again, good for Pat Pete getting significant money at his age, at this point in his career.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Vikings definitely weren't giving him that money, but good for him. I'm sure he'll be a good fit for what the Steelers do too. And Pat Pete he was here only a short amount of time, but I think he really endeared himself to the fans. So he's a good guy. It's tough to see him go, but yeah, it's a business, and this business move makes complete sense, I think, on both ends.
Yeah, and then the final note is the Vikings moved on from Cameron Dantzler. They waived him. And that saved them $2.7 million against the cap, or his contract was $2.7 million. When we talk about these numbers that the Vikings saved by players, you have to kind of mentally subtract the $750,000 that a minimum player costs to add to from the number. So technically, Cam Dantzler probably saved the Vikings $2 million. You know, it was a shocking signing, I think, a shocking cut for a lot of people, given how depleted the Vikings cornerback room is. I never thought Cam Dantzler was very good. Like, I never thought he played very well. He got benched by 3 different teams. Washington is the one who picked him up. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier or not. You know, I don't think Cam Dantzler was all that good. I don't think he's really a fit in a man coverage system. I mean, people talked maybe about him being a man coverage corner, but I think he's more of a press bail cover 3 corner who can defend, you know, outside and deep, but can't really go across the field and can't really do what you ask of as a man corner, because I don't think he has the fluidity to do that. So I didn't love him as a fit in the Flores system in the first place, and the Vikings seem to have moved on from him. You know, former 3rd round pick. It's a pretty significant thing to move on from that player, but again, Vikings, I guess, did not see the value in him.
Yeah, and you couldn't really rely on him because of his body type. You're always going to be worried about injuries, and he's been banged up and got beat out by Duke Shelley last year, got beat out by, a whole host of corners. So, there was a time when, you'd look back at his Mississippi State tape, that was his college team when he lined up against, I think, Jamar Chase.
Jamar Chase.
Everybody said, man, this guy has the potential to be something. And he had a impressive rookie season. So it's kind of shocking to see it come to an end this way. But at the same time, I feel like the red flags were always there between the injury history and cornerbacks can't be injury prone, because that's a position you really need to rely on. Like, you can't have one of your starting corners know that you're just going to miss him for like 6 games a year. So that made it tough. And then, I think you're right that he's not a fast corner, so that's a problem with man coverage, and he's not a fluid corner, so that's also a problem with man coverage. And he's got some press chops, but you need more than that to be able to survive in like a cover 1 world. So I do think between that and the injuries and the fact that they were trying to save money wherever they could, this one does make sense, even though they're very depleted at corner. So I get it.
Yep. And then the final former Viking who moved on is a guy who was not a Viking for very long. I believe we signed him to our practice squad when
Trivia fact. Pause the podcast right now and we'll see if you can name him, because if you do, I'll give you $500 or something.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll let that breathe for a second here, see if you can come up with the name of the final Vikings player who departed so far this offseason. There are many others who have not signed, and we're recording this on Friday evening at about 6 p.m. Eastern, so, you got your timeline in there in case we've missed anything on Twitter. But it is Greg Mancz, the center who we thought might have to start because we were basically out of centers at one point.
I guess Buffalo liked him, so he was also picked up by somebody else.
Yeah, it's like a league minimum contract. It's not all that big, and that's about all the analysis we have on him.
Shout out to Greg Mancz.
Yep. If we move over to restructures that the Vikings did to help with their salary cap situation, there are quite a few here as well. The big ticket item, and of course the one that everybody always freaks out about every time something happens with him, is Kirk Cousins. The Vikings took what would be a $20 million roster bonus and converted that into a signing bonus. They also had to get to the negotiating table with Kirk Cousins because they added 2 void years onto his deal. So adding those, and he now has 4 total void years on his deal. That signing bonus divides by 5, so it costs $4 million every year, which means that Kirk saved $16 million against the cap with this restructure. The Vikings saved $16 million against the cap by restructuring Kirk in this manner. There's a couple implications here. The first is that Kirk Cousins' contract still voids prior to the 2024 season. He would have a $28.5 million dead cap hit in 2024. The second is the $20 million that the Vikings restructured previously would have been tradable, and the team that traded for him would have, taken that on. Now, granted, that guaranteed on Friday, or that roster bonus would have been paid out today. We're recording this once again on Friday. Anyway, so they had a very limited window to do so if they wanted to trade him, right? But it's theoretically possible. Now, if the Vikings were to trade Kirk, it would cost them, again, $28.5 million in dead cap. post June 1st, they could spread that over 2 years, but that's just a consideration there. I don't think it's very likely that the Vikings are going to trade Kirk this year. Like, that's a very low, less than 5% chance outcome to me. The other, and we talked about what happens if his contract voids. The other outcome that's likely is the Vikings extending Kirk, and I think that's still well within the realm of possibility. And I think that actually adding those 2 void years helped significantly compared to not having those 2 void years in the contract. So because of the way it works, the money in those 4 future years right now is unchangeable. If the Vikings were to extend Kirk, they can't do anything about that money. They can't shift any money of that around. That just counts against the cap. And it's I believe just over $10 million, because it used to be $6.25 million. They added $4 million. So it's $10.24 million in both 2024 and 2025 that, if the Vikings extend Kirk, are going to count against the cap, and then $4 million in 2026 and 2027. If they had not done that and they'd saved the same $16 million, it would be up to $14 million in each of the next 2 years. And that's a really big number when you're trying to fit salaries in there as well, right? So I would say, because of the extra dead cap that's gone into the next couple of years that the Vikings can't change, I think restructuring the bonus and not getting a true extension done to Kirk makes it less likely that they'd extend him in this offseason. But I don't think it makes it, completely unlikely. I think it's about as likely, maybe slightly less likely, that the Vikings extend Kirk at this point than it was prior to this bonus conversion happening. And I truly don't have an answer either way on whether or not the Vikings will extend Kirk. Like, it's maybe leaning they let him play out the final year of his contract to me, but it's not that far off either way. I don't know if you have a different gauge on the situation, Nick.
Yeah, it feels like they're gonna, treat this as like a, franchise tag year. They're gonna let him play it out, and they'll go from there and see if they want to re-sign him, and if not, they'll make another move to somebody else. It feels like the quarterback market is kind of coalescing around, yes, let's pay the elite tier guys, but the Derek Carrs, the Kirk Cousins, the Jimmy Garoppolos, it's not entirely fair to Kirk to lump him in entirely with those kinds of guys, but say the guys who are not bona fide top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL, don't pay those guys, or pay them something mid-tier, but don't commit to them long term. And I feel like that probably helps, because I feel like this extension they did, or this what they did with Kirk Cousins' contract kind of is, I don't really necessarily see what Kirk gets out of it. It's not like they converted his salary to bonus. They converted a roster bonus to signing bonus, which is, it's not like he's getting the money like significantly faster, or it's not like he's getting guaranteed money that he wasn't getting before. And they added void years, which only helps the team. So I feel like, I don't know, in a weird way, Kirk kind of did the Vikings a solid, and I'm not sure he got anything in return for agreeing to this restructured contract. From the Vikings side, it makes sense. And it's probably notable just that I think now his contract is kind of untradeable, at least for the 2023 season, just because it would cause the signing bonuses to accelerate, and that would be more than I think the Vikings can afford on the cap right now. So I do think that makes it, a trade is probably unlikely at this point. But so maybe that's what Kirk got, is the reassurance that he wasn't going to get traded, at least for this year. I would like to trade Kirk, or try and get the savings from a long-term deal. I don't like letting him walk for a compensatory pick down the road, when you could get like a second rounder, maybe in a late first rounder for him. And, I'm ready to move on and find something else. And being that he's 35 years old, even if you love Kirk and want him to be the Vikings quarterback forever, you're going to have to move on too, because he's just, he's in his late 30s now, I guess, technically. So, it's for the 2023 Vikings here and now, I think it makes sense, because this was one of the moves to save a significant amount of money, and it didn't really hurt the Vikings either. So, makes sense, and makes sense, I think, for Kirk too. And it'll just, it muddies the pictures, I think, for 2024, but, we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Yeah. So the next player on the list is Harrison Smith, who agreed to a restructured contract. It appears that he lowered his base salary in 2022 from $14.7 million to $8 million, right? So he's still, and he has roster bonuses and a workout bonus in there too. So he's still taking home probably $8.6 million in cash this year. And I think it makes sense for both sides, right? Obviously, the Vikings needed to create cap space. Again, $19 million cap hit for Harrison Smith is probably untenable this season. From Harrison's side, he's 34 years old, right? Like, I don't think he's going to get an $8 million in cash this season on the open market. He probably had the ability to test that market and came back and was like, yeah, okay, I'm going to take this pay cut here. The reporting on the contract is also that it will void after this year, from what I saw. I don't know if you have had anything definite on that, Nick. Over the Cap hasn't updated his contract details yet.
Yeah, I saw that. He's also getting up to $2 million in incentives. So, we're still a little bit. We're recording this now because we want to get something to you now, but at the same time, a lot of these contract terms haven't been fully confirmed yet. So that's kind of, we're in a weird spot trying to talk about it, analyze it, while also it hasn't been fully figured out yet. So it's not clear if he'll be a free agent next year or not. But this was a significant pay cut. I mean, a lot of times when you talk about these restructures, it's like $1 million, $2 million. Jordan Hicks was a $1.5 million pay cut. This was a $6.7 million pay cut for Harrison Smith. That's a lot of money to leave. But
to be clear, we basically saved about as much money on the pay cut as we would have saved by cutting him entirely. So it's basically like cutting him, except we still have him on the team.
So it's interesting. He got a very player-friendly contract extension, and this was a very team-friendly renegotiated contract. And I think it's true. The safeties don't get paid, and 34-year-old safeties don't get paid. So I kind of understand what happened, but like I also understand why prior to it happening, there was a lot of hemming and hawing about like would Harrison Smith be cut and would he test the open market? And I think the Vikings knew that they had a lot of leverage because of where the safety market is and the fact that he's 34 years old. And selfishly for me, I'm really excited to see him. I really want to see him back on the line of scrimmage blitzing, and that's what he'll be doing a lot of in disguising, and that's what he'll be doing a lot of in Brian Flores' scheme that he wasn't really doing in Donatel's scheme. So selfishly, I'm really excited about that. But like, yeah, shout out to him for eating that 6 months. I mean, he's still making millions, but he's making almost half as much. So. It's an important move for the Vikings, and it sucks for him, but it's also really cool that we'll be able to see him in purple for at least one more year.
Yeah, and I have 3 jerseys of Vikings that were active 2 weeks ago, and Harrison Smith would have been the third one that would have gotten cut had he gotten cut. So it would have been definitely a blow to me, because Kendricks and Thielen are both gone. Losing him in the same offseason would have been rough. I'm really excited to see if we can rejuvenate him right in Flores' defense, kind of get that juice back into the defense with him, because he's just such a phenomenal player around the line of scrimmage that I'm excited that he's going to be back. The next restructure that we had was for Jordan Hicks. And as we alluded to earlier, we only saved $1.5 million. We moved his $5 million salary to a $3.5 million salary this year. This one, honestly, when I heard we'd restructured Jordan Hicks, I thought it was going to be a lot more significant than this. We got a lot of guys who we moved down to the minimum, and I'll just say them right now. Ross Blacklock and Chris Reed, we both restructured to the minimum. Jordan Hicks, I was thinking we'd probably get down, at least to like $2 million or something like that, right? Save a pretty significant chunk of money, but we kind of pinched pennies a little bit and saved $1.5 million. As you said earlier, Nick, it's almost like I'd rather have saved Kendricks and tried to figure out how to make money elsewhere, right? With Kendricks' $10 million, and just cut Jordan Hicks, because I think Kendricks is pretty clearly the better player. But at the same time, like, we need linebackers who can play football. So if the decision was to move on from Kendricks, keeping Hicks makes sense, from that perspective, in that at least we have, we're excited about Brian Asamoah and confident in him moving forward, but we still need a second player who can play off ball there. So that's what Hicks will be.
Yeah, and we need somebody who can fit the run, which Troy Dye cannot do. I'm not sure Asamoah can. I mean, Asamoah's got the spirit is willing, but the technique is weak. So it's as much as I harp on it, he's a player with clearly defined strengths and weaknesses. So yeah, I didn't love this move. I would have preferred to just cut him and wing it and try and find somebody else. But it does save them some money, and it's not like Jordan Hicks is a net negative. Like there are certainly worse linebackers, that we've seen, throughout the years on the Vikings So I get why they want to have this kind of floor here. But I worry that defense, and especially the back seven in coverage being a weak link system, is going to get exposed a lot, especially if Hicks is seeing significant snaps out there in man coverage, because that's a matchup disaster for the Vikings. So, or at least has the potential to be. I shouldn't overstate it, but yeah, he's not good. So, at least in man coverage. So, spot dropping into a hook, yeah, I'm fine with Hicks doing that. But yeah, it's not a strong suit. But better to have someone there than a complete black hole and be forced into drafting a linebacker in the first round because of it. So I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll flip over from guys we restructured to guys we've re-signed, and there's quite a number of people on this list actually. The top ticket items were Garrett Bradbury and Alex Mattison. We'll start with Garrett Bradbury. He got $17.7 million over 3 years, but that number is pretty deceptive. He's got a $2.6 million cap hit in 2023, and he has almost it's $4.9 million base salaries in 2024 and 2025. And I think his signing bonus was only $3 million. So the Vikings, if, it's kind of like a 1-year tryout for Bradbury. And then if they like it, they can keep him for pretty cheap in 2024 and 2025, right? Like a $6-7 million cap hit isn't that bad for a starting center if he is a quality player at that point. But they can move on from him from only like $2 million in dead cap in 2024 too. So it gives them quite a bit of flexibility in those 2 seasons. You need a center in the NFL. It turns out you need a guy who can snap the ball. Bradbury is pretty good with line calls and stuff like that. Obviously, from an execution perspective, he's not that great. I know his PFF grade was better this past season. I don't know if he materially improved versus was put in better situations is probably a more accurate way to say it. But he is a very talented run blocker, right? He's a very good run blocker. Pass protection, we know what his weaknesses are, and it's something that we did scheme around last year, right? Like, it's not something that we can scheme around. It's something that we did successfully scheme around. So I like the deal just in terms of we eliminated uncertainty, right? This is in line with other center contracts that went out, and it's cheaper than other center contracts that got paid out. And we talked about how there were like 5 or 6 guys in free agency at center, and Bradbury was one of them, who were, not high priced guys, but we might like. And I think all those guys pretty much came in more expensive than Bradbury if they've been signed to this point. So I don't know. That was a bunch of word soup to say I think it's a fine deal for a guy who's a 1-year tryout, basically, right?
Yeah, and I'm a little higher on Bradbury than probably most Vikings fans because I have special appreciation for what he does in the run game. But I also thought he was significantly improved in pass protection last year, and that's not just he's always had the potential to be. I don't want to say a good pass protector, but like for a center, a good pass protector. And the thing is about centers is like they're not supposed to be good pass protectors. They're not necessarily supposed to be able to survive forever, one on one with a good interior defensive line in pass rushing. They're supposed to get help most of the time. They're supposed to be double teaming nose guards and not necessarily be put on one with Aaron Donald. So yeah, in the past, I think Bradbury's problem is he gave up a lot of easy, quick pressure either because he like he would not be in a half man position right away, and somebody would just be able to sort of shoot the A gap right there, or he would just get bulldozed, and it would be kind of a technique issue where he's not like setting his feet or doesn't have like the right balance, and it was weird issue because Bradbury's like a very strong center, but he also gets bulldozed. So it wasn't like a lack of like physical strength or grip strength or anything, or like lower body. It's not like he's not doing his squats or whatever, skipping leg day. But last year, I think we finally started to see him lose a lot more slowly, and that's all. That's all you can really ask for from a center. And this contract that they gave him is like, I don't want to call it a steal, but like it's a heck of a bargain. I mean, he's the 15th highest paid center in the league. I think he was getting paid about this much on his rookie contract just as a first round pick. So
Yeah.
it's not like they're giving him a significant payday or anything here. And I feel like last year he was this overstates him. He was PFF's 11th highest graded center, and out of like the 32 starters out there. And that's probably skewed because he has a really good run blocking grade and a below average still pass blocking grade, but like the pass blocking went from people are picking on him because he's the weak link to people are not picking on him because he isn't the weak link. And then you add on top of it what he adds in the screen game, what he adds in terms of setting protections, the consistency you're getting for having him another year in the system rather than having somebody else come in and set all the protections and worrying about are they going to screw it up and being it not worrying about are they capable of snapping the ball in Chris Reed's case. So yeah, I feel like this is a very team-friendly contract with the potential to do significantly more because if he continues to improve the way he did last year, I think he has the potential to be a very good center. So I'm really happy about this one.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to pull out there is the amount that Bradbury's getting paid. Against the cap this year, he counts for 1.2% of the cap. That's the amount that he cost in his rookie season, and it's actually a slightly lower percentage than he did in his rookie season. The 1.2% is rounded. And then next year it'll be 2.5. The year after that it'll be 2.3. This past season, Bradbury accounted for 2% of the cap, right? So we're not seeing a significant difference from what we've been paying him for the past 4 years anyway. So I do think in terms of that value, like it's pretty clear that he's fine on the amount that he's getting paid, right? And it's also important to note the Vikings were very smart to not pick up his 5th-year option, which is guaranteed, right? Not pick it up just because they were uncertain. That would have been $14 million. Now, offensive line 5th-year options are totally screwed up because center costs the same as a left tackle, but still, like, you know, it was a very smart move, and that's almost the value of his contract, right? So I think that makes a ton of sense. Let's move on to Alex Mattison. He got 2 years, $7 million. 6.35 million of that is guaranteed per reporting. So with that, it's basically a guaranteed 2-year contract for Alex Mattison, right? And it's somebody who's going to be on the roster. I think Alex Mattison has been a fine running back too for us. Like, obviously he's not a world beater or anything. Many people don't like his performance. I think his performance is solid, right? He's not Dalvin Cook. He's not an explosive player, but I think he makes good decisions running the ball. He can make people miss. He can break tackles, and he will get what's blocked for him as a running back, right? Which is something I think you can work with at the NFL level. In terms of the amount we're paying him, maybe it's a bit much if you consider running backs, but for a second running back contract, this is pretty insignificant. It's an insignificant amount of the cap. I'm not too worried about it. I also do think this gives us flexibility when it comes to Dalvin Cook, right? As opposed to being stuck with Kenny Nwangwu and Ty Chandler, who people are excited about, but really have no NFL experience as a running back. This is a guy who has NFL experience. You know, he's somebody we can work with, particularly in tandem if we draft somebody, if we want to trade and move on from Dalvin Cook, which is still an open question and something we'll talk about a bit later. Do you have any more analysis on Madison, Nick?
I think if they keep Dalvin Cook, it's a mistake to re-sign Madison and pay him this money. But they're paying him an amount of money which puts him in the category of, 1B type backs or lead back of a committee. Like, for example, you look at some of the contracts, some of the other running backs signed, like Jamal. These 3.5 million a year is a little bit less than what Jamal Williams got. It's a little bit more than what Jeff Wilson or Raheem Mostert got in Miami with the two Dolphins backs. So, I mean, you're talking about, a guy who's not being paid to be a bell cow and is not being paid to be your lead back, but is, the amount of money there, I think the value there is if Madison is your 1A or whatever, and Chandler, whoever's your 1B, with some Nwangwu, scat back snaps. I think that's a pretty good backfield for the money. If they are also carrying Dalvin Cook at a $10 million cap hit or whatever, I think that's a mistake to have that much invested in the room. So I kind of have like an incomplete grade on this until we get resolution with what happens with Dalvin Cook, which we'll get to. But if they decide to move on from Dalvin Cook and this gives them that optionality, I really like the move because I think Cook's a better back because of his special footwork, his special contact balance and slipperiness, and his, I think, elite vision for a running back. He sees things in slow motion, and he's particularly good on those zone runs because of how well he sees holes. He sees holes open up and how well he manipulates second-level defenders to get them into the wrong hole I know there's been a lot of talk about, the advanced stats showing that he's slowed down or isn't picking up as much yards as you would expect him to. But I think running back models are generally bad because there's so much covariance between, what I just mentioned. Dalvin Cook makes his blockers look better than they are because he will get them to put them in a position to seal a blocker that they otherwise, you'll have a guy like sitting there in space, and Dalvin Cook will manipulate them to open up his own gap, and then the model will say like, "Oh, look, you got tackled by your shoestring through this gap." And it's like, yeah, because Dalvin Cook set it up. So I didn't expect to go on a little mini rant about why I still think Dalvin Cook is good. Maybe not as good as his Pro Bowl nod is, but he's still a good back. That said, I do think he's not as bursty or as fast as he used to be. Maybe that's injuries, maybe that's not necessarily age, but I do think Mattison has better burst at this point. He's got great initial, those first few steps. I think he comes out screaming with the ball, and he doesn't have Cook's vision. Certainly doesn't have Cook's vision or footwork, but he does have good contact balance himself. Whereas Dalvin Cook's really good at making backs slip off of him, whereas Madison is more like going to jump over you or barrel through you. So it's a little bit different kind of contact balance, I guess, or ability to make defenders miss. He's more of a run through you than a run around you type. But I do feel like Madison is good enough to be a lead back in a committee. So this is a long-winded way of saying, like, I like the move if they move on from Cook, and if they choose to pay both Madison and Cook, I think that's not the best use of resources. So that's where I'll leave it.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with that sentence right there, right? If they keep Cook, it's not a good use of resources to keep Madison, right? But if they move on from Cook, which I think we would expect them to do at this point, it is a good use of resources. I think for Dalvin Cook, I agree with generally what you said. Like, I think he's still a very good running back, and I think he's a very technically proficient running back, and that's important to me. But it's just it's the unfortunate reality of running back contracts that they're not worth the value that you end up paying them, right? Especially when you give them significant extensions. So, if we jump into Cook really quickly here, I mean, I would expect the Vikings to trade him at this point based on that Madison signing. It's still up in the air to me. I'm not sold on that, right? I think the Vikings could still keep him. If I were the Vikings, I'd trade him for whatever I get. And there's a complicating factor with that, right? That Dalvin Cook had shoulder surgery. So if you trade him, you need him to be able to pass a physical for the other team. So you would probably have to wait to see him traded. But it's something I would want to do if I'm the Vikings. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm not surprised. I mean, some fans probably are surprised that teams are willing to pay picks, but like we said, like he's still a good back, and I think he can still be a lead back for a lot of teams, and would be an upgrade over a lot of other what a lot of teams currently have. So, yeah, and to add on the fact that it would save the Vikings $8 million if he's traded and is able to pass his physical, that makes sense. Now, if they do have to cut him because there aren't any, if somebody's like, oh well, you're going to cut him anyway, so we'll just call your bluff and wait for you to actually cut him. It's a little bit more complicated because that $2 million of injury guarantees now is vested, or that he had a $2 million guarantee vest already. So if he's cut instead of he's traded, then the Vikings still are on the hook for that $2 million. But there's offset language in his contract that if somebody else pays him enough money, the Vikings will get that most of that $2 million back, depending on his future contract. So kind of a wash if they do end up needing to cut him. That said, for a team with only, 5 draft picks now with the comp pick, getting another one, even if it's a day 3 pick for Cook, I think is a win-win, especially when you get Madison back at a cheaper contract. So I think all of this makes sense. And if they are able to move Cook, I feel like that's a really good place to be, get value for Cook after everything he's done for the Vikings. So will be interesting to see where that goes, because it does right now, it does kind of feel like they've got, bad pun coming, but they've got too many Cooks right now in the backfield.
Yeah, we'll go from having the league's only 2 Dalvins to having no Dalvins in one off season, so that'll be a little bit disappointing. But if you had your over under for number of Dalvins below 0.5, you're looking pretty. So yeah. No, if we keep rolling through the rest of the re-signings here, there's nothing super significant. The Vikings brought back Nick Mullins. He's a perfectly competent backup. I think he's more competent than a lot of the backups we had in the Zimmer era. So I like the re-signing there. 2 years, $4 million on that. the two specialists who were free agents, Greg Joseph and Andrew DePaulo, we brought back. Andrew DePaulo was more than league minimum from a long snapper, which is a kind of a question mark to me, but also he was an All-Pro last year, so sure, why not? Greg Joseph I don't like as much because he was bad, and he's been bad. He like something like 28th in field goal percentage last year, and around league minimum, even if you adjust for the fact that like all of his misses were over 50 yards basically, and a bottom 5 in extra point percentage like each of the last 2 seasons. It's a problem. I don't really know why we brought him back. I hope we bring back competition, but we also guaranteed him like at least $1 million. So it's kind of an interesting decision there to me. And then finally,
Yeah, he's bad. They gave him. I'll be really quick because they're special teamers, but they gave Joseph over $1 million, $1.2 million guaranteed, which signals to me that they're not really going to have a true camp competition, which is disappointing because I feel like as much as they talk him up, Joseph isn't very good, or he just doesn't deliver on game day, and that's been true for several years now. So I would have liked to see them give themselves the optionality to move on from him, even while still being able to have him on the team. So I don't love the Joseph move, but I'm not going to get stressed out over a kicker, at least until the season starts. And then DePaula, DePaula, it's a little bit. It's what, $4 million over 3 years, so $1.3 million a year. I mean, he has been like the best long snapper in the league for a while, and that's Vikings. Have had plenty of bad experiences with bad snaps. So, I mean, like you said, he was an All-Pro. He was the highest graded long snapper by the psychos at PFF, who actually grade every long snap, and he was the second highest graded in 2021 and 2020. So I get it. It's nice to have him on. He is getting a little old, but snapping a ball, I feel like that ages well. You can probably do that for a while. So, shout out to the long snappers.
Yeah, absolutely. So we also tendered to IRFA's exclusive rights free agents, and they are Kairos Tonga and Blake Brandel. I feel like we've already covered this on the podcast. It's just, they're part of the list. And I love bringing both of them back. I think it's a no-brainer to bring both of them back. Basically, the Vikings had the option: you play for us or you play for nobody. So it's a good move on their part to me. And then finally, we brought back Ben Ellefson and Kenny Willekes. I think they were practice squad guys. I don't even remember where they were, but they're basically camp competition. They're both on league minimum contracts for their number of accrued seasons. So that's totally fine to me. You need to fill out a 90-man roster somehow, and those are a couple of the guys filling out the 90-man. So if we move on to guys who are still free agents for the Vikings, I'm going to start with the guys I don't want back, just to keep us rolling a little bit here. Chandon Sullivan, obviously no. Jonathan Bullard with the signing of Dean Lowry today, as camp competition, fine. Jonathan Bullard would be fine. Other than that, I don't really care. Irv Smith Jr., I think his time has run its course with all the tight ends we have now. Oli Udo, I think would be totally fine to bring back. I just don't have, he's depth once again, right? I'd bring him back on a league minimum deal. Chris Boyd, special teams, league minimum deal for me as well, right? Very limited deal for Chris Boyd for me. And BC Johnson, I want the Vikings to bring back as camp competition, right? He's had such a really unfortunate career the past couple years. Where he's had season-ending injuries in training camp both times, and he's supposedly looked good in training camp both times. So that's it's been exciting with him, and then bad news because he ends up getting injured. So I would like to bring him back, especially with us moving on from Thielen. We need a quality third wide receiver on the team, so he's somebody I'd like to see us attempt to retain if we can. Any thoughts on those guys, Nick? Before we move on to Duke Shelley, who we actually want.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I'd bring back Irv, but I feel like he'll be priced out. I wouldn't give him that much more than that minimum.
Mm-hmm.
I would be interested in bringing Sullivan back, but not necessarily as cornerback depth, more because of I feel like he could have some run at safety. I feel like he's got really good click and close. He's got really good burst, and he's got good eyes on on quarterbacks, and he's got the physicality and the willingness to kind of play in the box. His problem is he doesn't have the hips or the speed that you want in a cornerback, and so you don't want him playing man coverage. But as a versatile kind of dime back, I feel like you can find a room for a player like that even on a more man heavy scheme. So I don't know, him and Chris Boyd, we need corners anyway, so you might as well try and see if they can come back. Duke Shelley's the big one though, and I want Duke Shelley back because I feel like. Flores likes to play dime back. He likes to play dime. He likes to get 4 cornerbacks out there. He likes to bring out extra safeties. So I feel like there's room. And then with Booth being a bit of a question mark, and basically all the corners being question marks. I feel like you need somebody like Duke Shelley, and he played well enough, and he kind of has the story like he like every single play he plays like, this is cliche, but he plays like it's his last snap of football ever,
Yeah.
and he gives everything on the field. So really easy guy to root for. And had like put up some legitimately very impressive tape. So for his sake and for what he's gone through, I hope he gets paid. But selfishly as a Vikings fan, I really hope it's in purple next year too.
Yeah, this guy heart and gritted himself into being like a good player, right? Because he's like 5'8", he's not very big. He's not a great athlete by any means, but like he had some pretty good coverage chops, and I think what was particularly impressive is how he played at the catch point despite his size, right? Like he had a really good knack for breaking up passes, and I think that's due to timing, that's due to being able to understand the receiver, being able to understand how the receiver is addressing the catch, and that's like a skill for corners that he really has, and I think would be valuable for the Vikings, right? Like the Patriots last year ran out with a bunch of 5'10" guys at corner. They didn't have a big 6 foot. Well, they had Jalen Mills, but Jalen Mills isn't really all that good, right? So they didn't really have big corners. Most of their significant snap players were 5'10" and shorter. I think Duke Shelley can kind of fit in the system. So I really want him back as well. So we touched on Dalvin Cook as a contract still in limbo. The other contract still in limbo is Za'Darius Smith, and this is tied to Marcus Davenport, who did officially sign with the Vikings today, or at least it was reported that he was in the building and signing the contract by Ben Gessling. So initially when Davenport was signed, right, the report was 1 year, $13 million. That's probably funny money, but we don't have the full report yet, so we're going to go with 1 year, $13 million. Za'Darius Smith says almost exactly $13 million if you cut him. It seemed like a one-for-one replacement. But as the week went on, it seemed the Vikings probably are not going to grant Za'Darius Smith's wish of a release that would save them $12.5 million against the cap, but they also no longer save that $12.5 million against the cap because $5 million of it guaranteed today, just over $5 million of it if we want to get technical. They would still save that money if they traded him. So trading him is still on the table, but I think completely cutting him is off the table. And based off of, I've watched some Marcus Davenport, and based off of that tape, I think that I'm pretty happy that the Vikings stuck with Za'Darius Smith and are projected to have a 3-man rotation of Davenport, Hunter, and Smith this season. Like, I like that. I like having horses in the stable at the pass rush position. It's a very important position for you to have. I think Za'Darius Smith still has it. I think Za'Darius Smith is of value at the contract, so I think it would have been a mistake for the Vikings to just release him. So I'm happy that they kind of stood their ground here and did not choose to release him into free agency.
Totally, 100%. I mean, if you're going, I don't want to, spoil our Marcus Davenport discussion too much, but if you're going to replace Za'Darius Smith with somebody, I think Davenport is probably the smallest downgrade you could do, because I'm pretty high on Davenport's potential and what he can do when he's healthy. But he's no Za'Darius Smith, who had 10 sacks last year, whereas Davenport had half of one. So that's just a tiny bit difference in terms of actual production on the field. But I definitely think there's room for all three of them, especially given that I feel like Davenport you can kick inside to 4-eye. Za'Darius Smith obviously notorious for being able to kick inside, particularly on passing downs and take on guards. Don't necessarily want him to fit the run from inside, but I think both of them you could probably get away with a little bit with some snaps at 4-eye. And I think they're both really good. They have like the heavy hands and like the ability to sort of hunker down in a 4-point stance when they need to against the run. So there's definitely, when I first saw the Davenport signing, I was like, that's really interesting, because he's the kind of guy who could pop off and you let him walk next year and get a comp pick, or he pops off and then he becomes a guy you build around as somebody who's like a top 20 pass rusher long term. So I like the signing from that perspective. But then I thought about like, oh, what if they keep all three? Because you want to keep guys fresh, and I feel like this was a huge problem with the Vikings last year. Is they only rush with 4 most of the time, and Za'Darius Smith and Danielle Hunter generated pressure, but there were a lot of snaps out there when it was Danielle Hunter and Za'Darius Smith were off the field, and the pressure production went to nothing because as much as I may joke about DJ Wanham and Patrick Jones, they were just significant downgrades. So having a player of Davenport's potential. It's kind of like having, in basketball terms, it's like having a sixth man out there who can really, bring together that backup team. So I think that has the potential, if they keep all three of them, I think that has the potential to have a significantly improved defensive line because, the starters last year were all really good, but the backups, who got a significant amount of snaps, were not. And, the Hunter and Zadarius Smith both played, 75, I think 80% of snaps, which is on the high end. You probably want to keep them a little bit fresher than that. I do think between the three of them and between NASCAR sets and pass sets and having all three of them out there on passing downs and also having all three of them out there on certain base downs or odd front looks where one of them, maybe Davenport, is in a 4-eye, I feel like you can definitely find enough snaps for all of them and to keep all the mouths fed and to keep everybody happy. So, yeah, I feel like they have with Zadarius Smith, they have all the leverage. He signed a contract when he was coming off a season-ending injury, and then he went and had a Pro Bowl season, and now he wants the kind of contract you get coming off a Pro Bowl season. But that's not how contracts work. So
Yep.
the Vikings have all the leverage. I don't expect them to cut him. It might. They try to keep it pretty player friendly. So I don't think they would let it necessarily get to a point where it's like a holdout. But so maybe they give him more guarantees or they give him incentives or something to make him happy. But I do feel like Zadarius Smith, unless they find a very attractive trade proposal, I feel like Zadarius Smith will probably be a Viking right now. And I'm going to have egg on my face because by the time this podcast gets released, he'll be traded. But
No.
I feel like, yeah, there's room for everybody. So
I definitely expect Smith to be a Viking unless the Vikings get like a second or third round pick offered to them. And given that Darren Waller was traded for a third round pick, I don't think the Vikings are getting that much compensation, right? Given also the trade for Jalen Ramsey, right? Like teams just don't give up that much in terms of draft capital for players who are over 30 years old, no matter how good those players are, unless they're quarterbacks, right? Quarterbacks don't count. Or, wide receivers maybe, but those are the only two positions where they give up significant capital. Yeah. Let's roll it into Marcus Davenport because we just had a good discussion about Zadarius Smith. I've gotten through a couple games of Davenport tape so far. Again, it's a 1-year, $13 million deal. We don't know any more details beyond that. I highly doubt that the cap hit for Davenport is $13 million this year, but we'll have to wait and see, right? Whether it's tricky with not likely to be earned incentives or something like that. Marcus Davenport only had half a sack last year, so you put in literally any sack incentive into that contract, and it becomes not likely to be earned, right? So, Nick, why don't you first give your thoughts on Davenport?
yeah, like I said, I thought it was a really surprising signing. It's like you wouldn't have expected the Viking. It's like when you're scouting for the draft and you don't scout a position. Like I'm not watching a lot of like Peter Soronsky or whatever because the Vikings are pretty set at tackle. With Davenport, I'm not watching. I wasn't like paying a lot of attention to the edge rusher market because I feel like Hunter and Zadarius Smith are both under contract. So it was surprising that they went out and signed probably the best edge rusher in the free agency class. In Marcus Davenport. He's been for a long time Cam Jordan's number 2, with New Orleans, rushing from the right side if you're an offensive guy or the left side if you're a defensive guy. He's powerful, heavy hands, fits the run well, generates a lot of pressure and has trouble finishing, I feel like is a fair scouting report. And there's Kwesi being an analytics guy, you can probably fairly say that they're betting on some regression to the mean. Pressures notoriously, famously predict future sack percentages, future sack production a lot better than actually sacks do. So if you're looking for a buy low candidate, I feel like Marcus Davenport is the perfect potential, both because he's young, because he's only coming off half a sack last year, and because there's some injury concerns. I think he missed a few games last year with a back injury or something. So. But you come to Minnesota, which with their A+ across the board NFLPA ratings and sports science, Tyler Williams, everybody, and you bank on him to be healthy and to turn things around like they did with Zadarius Smith. That one worked out pretty well. I feel like there's strong potential for this to work out really well. I feel like he's a good fit for the system. He's got great first step, great burst. He's an athletic type of player, so there's. You don't normally talk about veteran free agents having a lot of upside, but I feel like compared to some of the 30-year-old guys who are kind of on the decline, I think his star is rising, and I feel like Mike Smith, having turned guys athletic molds balls of clay, like Rashawn Gary into something. I feel like there's potential for Marcus Davenport to become something even more. He's already got, he's got a good selection of moves. I feel like he primarily wins with power, but he can also, he's got enough burst upfield to sort of get guys to overset and then counter inside with a rip or a swim move to the other side too. So, he's really stout against the run. He sets a very strong edge. So, I feel like he is an above average player with potential to sort of be, one of the later Pro Bowl players, like a top 20-ish player at the position or in that conversation when he's healthy. Health is a concern. Whether he's putting it all together, those are all concerns, and those are the reasons why you're getting him for, 13 million and not 25 million, which is what his potential would be worth. But in terms of just the player you're getting, I feel like I really like that. This to me, this is like an A+ signing because I really like the impact he'll have. I really like the buy low, and I really like the potential for him to play at to give you value significantly beyond $13 million. So, but you've watched more tape of him than I have. So what do you think, Matt?
So I'll go into this a little bit, and I think there's a couple things to get out of the way here first. First, Saints fans hate Marcus Davenport. I think they hate more what Marcus Davenport represents than the player himself. And part of the issue with Davenport is that the Saints traded 2 first-round picks to get him, right? Which is ludicrous at the time, but the Saints do ludicrous draft things all the time, so we really shouldn't expect too much from them in that department. The second thing is that the Saints let Trey Hendrickson, who's a better player than Marcus Davenport, walk because they couldn't afford Trey Hendrickson because they have all these cap problems. But trust me, the cap's a myth. Don't worry about it. And then, they kept Marcus Davenport, and he didn't live up to it. I will say Davenport has missed games with injury every season of his career, right? So it's not just a single year of injury or a single injured year. It's been something that's been a problem consistently throughout his career. So that would be a concern. The Vikings, as you mentioned, have a very good training staff. I saw Football Outsiders adjusted games lost came out a couple weeks ago. Kind of got lost in all this free agency shuffle, but the Vikings went from somewhere in the 20s in 2021 to 5th in 2022 in adjusted games lost, and the Rams went from being 5th or in the top 5 every year under our current training staff to being down in the 20s, right? So I do think there is something there with the Vikings training staff in terms of what they're doing from a sports science and load management point to keep players more healthy. So I think that is a positive for Davenport quite a bit. And with Davenport, I have 2 exposures to him so far. I was getting ready to load the third one, and then we started to record this because we kind of need to get it done. But I got the Bengals game, and I got the Eagles game. The Eagles game is like a nothing burger. He plays 15 snaps. My concern with that is he doesn't look engaged in the game at all. Like he's not trying. He gets completely shut down by Jordan Mailata, who's a very good left tackle, but like he got absolutely nothing against Mailata in that game. Like there wasn't even a prayer of a hope of him doing something. And again, this is in 15 snaps, right? So it's not like he's playing 60 snaps or something like that. But that's another point with Davenport is I think the most snaps he's ever played in the season is like 5 in the 500s, right? Like he's not playing a ton of snaps. Zadarius Smith played 70 snaps last year, and that's with load management for injury. Danielle Hunter played over 900, right? So that's a pretty significant difference. Like if we're going to ask him to start, that's a huge upgrade in terms of the number of snaps he has to take. The Bengals game was a lot more promising. However, I asked Sands, Mike, I forget his last name, but Bengals Sands on Twitter about Jonah Williams in that game, because Jonah Williams looked horrendous in that game. Like he looked unplayable as a left tackle, just the way he was playing. And I found out that Jonah Williams had dislocated his kneecap the week before. And what was happening in the game is Jonah Williams could not protect his inside at all. It looked like he was oversetting constantly in the game, and Davenport got him a couple times on pretty nifty inside moves, right? But he couldn't plant off of that foot, and he couldn't get inside. So that's kind of a concern for me. Like with that added context, it put what became a really good game into a game I still have questions about, because I question, like you mentioned, I think he's got pretty solid burst off of the line of scrimmage, and you see that in the Bengals game, but he still doesn't win around the edge against Williams. There's one rep where he wins around the edge on the edge against Williams. Like he doesn't have the bend that you kind of require from a pass rusher. So I like him a lot more as an interior guy, and he beat up the Bengals left guard in that game. Like, he got great push back into the pocket on the Bengals left guard. So it would be more in the Zadarius Smith goal mold, right? Of a guy who's not, the bendiest, where he has to work through players. And I think Zadarius Smith is what you like. The high level Zadarius Smith play is what you see as the ceiling for Marcus Davenport on my end, which, again, it's a 1-year prove it deal, right? It's a guy who's had NFL production, he's had injury concerns, so you kind of need to balance that into a 1-year prove it deal. I would be concerned if he were our bona fide starting edge across from Danielle Hunter, not only because of the injury concerns, because I didn't see the consistency on tape. In run defense, I agree. Like, he shocks guys with his initial punch, and he did it to Jordan Mailata. Now, the thing is, like, he'll shock guys with his initial punch, and then they'll be able to anchor on him. So there is a little bit of concern there, but he beat up tight ends in the run game against the Bengals. So I do think he's pretty quality in the run game. It's just like, I have concerns about his fluidity and movement, so I don't think he's ever going to be a truly complete pass rusher. But I think given the right role, and the Vikings with both Smith and Hunter on the team have the capacity to put him in the right role, he'll be a quality player, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. That's all really good insight.
So with that rant on Davenport out of the way, I want to flip it over to Byron Murphy. He signed a 2-year, $17.5 million deal. It was initially reported, I believe, as 2-year, $20 million. I think he has like $2 million in not likely to be earned incentives in each season. Those are for things like, I think it's a playtime, Pro Bowl, All Pro, those postseason awards. So, he could earn more on the contract, but it's a great contract for the Vikings in that it's a 1-year cap hit of less than $5 million. And he costs only $3.5 million for the Vikings to cut next season if they need to move on from him, and not have a $12 million cap hit against him. So it's an extremely team-friendly contract for the Vikings. The other thing means if Byron Murphy plays well, he's stuck on that contract in the 2024 season, right? And the Vikings have the ability to renegotiate with him there. Murphy's played a ton of snaps. He's been a starter since day one with the Cardinals. He was the number 33 overall pick, right? The first pick of the second round. He's been a starter since day one. He's had slot flexibility. He's played outside, so I think the Vikings are getting that in him. And also, he had his only significant injury last year was a back injury. It caused him to miss the final 8 games of the season. So that probably depresses market value quite a bit, I would say, right? Missing that time with the back injury. Back injuries are a concern. Listening to Luke Braun on Locked On Vikings, right? Friend of the pod, Luke Braun. He said apparently it was a muscle tear. It was like a grade 2 muscle tear in the lower back, which isn't like a disc issue or like a vertebrae issue. So hopefully it wasn't a major issue for him. But do you have thoughts on Byron Murphy, Nick, before we go back to my tape study of him once again?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. One, he's one of the few young cornerbacks on the market. I mean, there were a lot of James Bradbury's and Jonathan Jones's and Patrick Peterson's on the free agent market. But in Byron Murphy, they've got a guy who is just starting to hit the prime of his career. I think he's 25 years old. So we're talking about for a veteran free agent. He came out young, but he still has a lot of snaps under he's still got plenty of experience, but he's also still really young. So I think from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense. He's a guy who has a lot of experience playing a lot of man coverage. I mean, Vance Joseph kind of moved away from it a little bit in the last couple of years, but certainly in 2020, they were one of the most man-heaviest teams in the league. Actually, interestingly, back with Patrick Peterson that year, and I think didn't necessarily work out for them too well. But when they did that, but I feel like it's a scheme fit from the perspective of he's a guy who has the tools to play man coverage. He's not an all-world athlete, so he's not like a height, weight, speed prospect at cornerback, but what he does do is he has fluidity, very little wasted movement with his feet. Coming out of college, he had a lot of experience with press bail, and so that's kind of, not that necessarily Flores is a press bail type system, but you do need the ability to sort of have the patience and play guys with press and wait for them to declare with their hips before you declare with your hips as a cornerback, and he can do all that very well. So what he brings to the table, I feel like, is a good skill set of ability to read cornerbacks or ability to read wide receivers, patience in coverage, ability to stick with his man in man coverage. And he's young. He has inside outside versatility, which right now the Vikings don't necessarily, or previously didn't really have a nickelback on the roster.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you pencil him in there because it'd be a bit of a waste of his contract to necessarily put him in there when you can find probably a cheaper nickelback out there. But he brings that versatility. Certainly, if they bring back Duke Shelley and they want to go dime, maybe he can be your other dime back. So that versatility is great. He's also a really good blitzer. He's physical and run support. So I feel like there's potential for him to kind of be just a guy. He's not like an all-world cornerback, and I feel like the lack of athleticism gets to him a little bit, or the lack of just being able to necessarily stay in phase throughout the entire route. He's not an all-pro corner, but he's also somebody who I think, like some of these other guys, I feel like he's a guy whose star is ascending and has the potential to be significantly better in a way that a lot of free agents, you kind of know what you're getting. With Marcus Davenport, with Byron Murphy, there's a potential you're getting something significantly better than what they put on tape the last few years. That's certainly true in the Cardinals, where we saw Patrick Peterson had a bit of a career resurgence after coming out and looking washed in Arizona. The other thing I would say Byron Murphy is, for the last couple of years, he, really since the departure of Patrick Peterson, he's been the Cardinals' number one cornerback, and Vance Joseph has not shied away from having him shadow opposing number one wide receivers. That includes the DK Metcalfs of the world, the Devonta Adams of the world, and he's put up some pretty good tape there. So, I mean, you've watched him, again, more than I have, so I'm interested to hear, Matt, what you think about Byron Murphy and his fit in Flores' scheme.
Yeah, honestly, I'm super stoked about this signing. Like, so where I'm kind of more lukewarm on Davenport as a player, like I have that as a B plus, kind of range in terms of a signing for the value that the Vikings are getting on it. I think Byron Murphy's an A plus. Like, I honestly don't get why he didn't have a bigger market. Well, I see why he didn't have a bigger market, and then like the NFL is kind of missing out because they look at certain things like his athleticism and are downgrading him so significantly for that it, kind of shadows over the rest of what he's able to do. Because I don't think he's ever going to be a guy who's going to be a true lockdown number one corner. But I think he's going to be a guy who right now plays at like a fringe Pro Bowl, second team all pro level, in all honesty. And it's because he lacks that top end speed, and it's clear that he lacks the top end speed, that you're not getting that true lockdown corner, right? But everything else is on point. Like, he's an incredibly fluid athlete. I can't stress enough how fluid he is as a player. We had a lot of conversations about cornerbacks on this podcast last year, right? Talking about rookies coming in. And I didn't really get it with Trent McDuffie, from like, he was a fluid player, but he was undersized and he wasn't that great of an athlete. Byron Murphy is the idealized version, and I don't think this is helmet scouting, like, because they both went to Washington or whatever. Like, Byron Murphy is your idealized version of that. He's got great feet. He's great in press. He locks down Devonta Adams on multiple reps. Like, I can't stress, like, that had a big impact to me. And I will say, like, I just looked at his PFF grades real quick. I watched 3 of his 4 best games in I watched 4 games in 2022, and I went back and watched our Vikings game in 2021 as well. So I watched 3 of his 4 best games. They were against the Vikings, us, where he went up primarily against Justin Jefferson in coverage, right? They were against the Raiders, where he went up primarily against Devonta Adams in coverage, and they were against the Eagles, where he went up against Devontae Smith and AJ Brown in coverage, right? So it's like he's going up against the best wide receivers in the NFL, and he's having good games. He had a worse game against DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett in Seattle. It was his second worst graded game, but I didn't even think it was all that bad of a game. Like, he's not getting beat in coverage a lot. There were a couple reps where DK Metcalf beat him. He was also out physicaled on a couple reps. And physicality is a question for me with him, not in the route. Like, he's very physical throughout the route. He will get up in players' faces. He's physical at the catch point. There's a rep of him being physical at the catch point with DK Metcalf where it completely shuts him down. And that's hard to do because DK Metcalf is like the biggest physical freak of a wide receiver in the NFL, right? Just in terms of like the size speed combo and strength. But he does that. It's in the run game. Like, he seems disinterested in getting into piles. He will force from the outside when he has force responsibility. But other than that, like, he doesn't seem interested in tackling players on quick screens. Like, he doesn't wrap them up. He just kind of rides players out of bounds, lets them get a couple yards. He'll dive at players' feet. So I have concerns about the run game physicality which is a question and something that needs to be done in Flores' defense. I think we can get away with not asking him to do it. I have concerns about the long speed, but in terms of from a technical perspective, playing cornerback, playing press man, he's great. He locks guys down. He doesn't lose reps against like Devontae Adams. He doesn't lose reps against Tyler Lockett in terms of quickness and that sort of thing. In zone, I think he processes things really well. He passes things off really well. He understands his landmarks. He feels offensive players moving behind him in zone and puts his body in a good position to stay between the player and the cornerback, which is a really difficult thing to do. Like, all of the things I'm talking about are rare things that you see from a cornerback, and Byron Murphy is doing them. That's why I'm really excited about him. Like, I was shocked with how much I liked him, honestly, after watching the tape. And it's because he does everything you could possibly ask from a cornerback, except, you know, he's not quite as fast. So he doesn't have great recovery speed. He does play out of phase pretty well, but he can't recover on guys if they beat him off the line of scrimmage. So that's a concern, right? But for a guy who's making $5 million this year, for a guy who's making $8 million a year on his contract, like, I think it's a huge win for the Vikings to get this guy if he can stay healthy. And he's only had the one injury throughout his career, really. So I think he will be able to stay healthy. And I will say, in 2021 against the Vikings, he did not look as good. There were multiple reps where he lost back shoulder. I think length plays a little bit of an issue with him as well. He's got, you know, just over 30-inch arms. Like, he can't necessarily contest at the catch point. But he clicking. And here's another thing. Sorry, going back. I trashed his physicality in the run game. Like, there are plays against the Eagles where he has screens, he clicks and glows, he hits the guys hard. It's a loss of yardage behind the backfield, right? So he's not unwilling to tackle necessarily. It's just weird how he only chooses specific situations to tackle. And like, he will play a bit further off of guys, but he's so quick to transition forward. It's not like a Cam Dantzler of he's going to constantly let up like 10-yard plays. He's going to limit those plays to 6 yards and maybe get pass breakups and maybe get some interceptions on those plays. Even if he's playing a bit further off. So I don't know. I'm just really excited. I'm really stoked about it. And I was kind of surprised with how stoked I was between watching the tape, because I just think he's so smooth and so dynamic of an athlete when covering like literally the best receivers in the NFL. It's kind of crazy to me.
Do you feel like the lack of long speed shows up a lot on tape, like on go routes or on crossing routes, or are guys running away from him, or does he just keep himself in good position that you don't necessarily see it?
Like on go routes and stuff, he generally keeps himself in good position. The one thing I will say I have a concern is he got beat on 2 routes against the Vikings in 2021 that were deep comebacks. So I think in those he's straining to keep up, and then he overruns the comeback, right? He's not able to make the turn in time because he's running too hard forward. And that was against Jefferson and Thielen, and probably a slightly more athletic version of Thielen, right? Who's always been good at those types of routes, right? He's always been great at selling those types of routes anyway. But I didn't see him in man coverage get beat straight vertical. I saw him I shouldn't say that. I didn't see him get beat consistently at all in man coverage straight vertical. Like when he was an outside corner with no safety help over the top, he really didn't get beat vertical. He had, I do have a couple concerns, like in zone, he let DK Metcalf just completely blow by him in one zone play. There were a couple other where you can see that he's not quite as fast. There was also one press rep on KJ Osborne from the slot where KJ Osborne won off the line and he had multiple steps of separation and Murphy wasn't able to make up that separation. There were instances where Murphy had safety help over the top and he very clearly used that safety help, playing out of phase behind the receiver, watching the receiver's intent so he can cover the break, which is like the correct technique in that situation. But it should be noted that he didn't have to worry about the vertical threat, so maybe the vertical threat speed is a bit more of a concern than I've made it out to be.
Interesting. Well, yeah, I'm really excited to see him. I mean, we went from having like, who the heck is going to be the number one corner to now kind of being written in pen on the depth chart. So hope he lives up to his potential. And even if not, I feel like he gives you a very solid floor at the position as well, especially compared to the Andrew Booths, The
Hmm.
guys who you don't necessarily know where they're going to come in at. So even a Caleb Evans, you're not necessarily sure with the concussions how many games, how many snaps you're going to get him out there for. Don't have those concerns with Murphy. So I think this is definitely a really exciting signing for the Vikings.
Yeah, I think he can shadow guys. I think he can be your CB1. I think also like with the amount of money we paid him, like it's totally possible for the Vikings to go out and get somebody else who's got, at a similar price point, or, allow somebody else to develop into that true CB1. If they're able to draft somebody, or one of the guys we already have on the team who I think have a ton of potential, really turn it on this year or something like that. So spent a lot of time on Murphy, but I'm really excited on him. Let's move to Josh Oliver, which was the first signing that the Vikings announced, which I think panics some people, right? The first thing the Vikings do is go out and pay a tight end $7 million a year when we already have TJ Hawkinson. Well, there's a couple things to that, right? First of all, the $7 million a year thing, 3 years, $21 million total. I think there's incentives to go above that even. It's not really a 3 year, $21 million contract. He's got a $10 million cap hit in the last year of the deal, and you can save $8 million of that by cutting him, right? Josh Oliver has a $3.5 million cap hit this season, right? So that's half of the $21 million, and I think it's about $7 million next year. Um, he's a blocking tight end. He's going to be tight end 2 next to TJ Hawkinson. He graded out really well blocking for the Ravens last year. I don't have a much in terms of having watched him. I will say I still think that this is more than I personally would want to dedicate to a second tight end. I do think this signals the Vikings are going to run more 12 personnel next year, but honestly, how much more can that be? Like, even the 2021 Vikings ran like 50% 12 personnel. And, that's what, 600 snaps for a player you're paying, $3.5 million this year, $7 million. And if you want to get other guys in the rotation there, you're going to have him have even less snaps. And if you want to keep TJ Hawkinson in the future, you're going to pay this guy a lot more money to still see like less than half the snaps, right? Like, teams don't go into 12 personnel more than 50% of the time. Like, teams typically only use to 12 personnel like 10% or so of the time, right? Like, it's not a thing. Even if the Vikings intend to go max 12 personnel, that's going to be like 50% of the time. You're paying a lot of money for a guy who doesn't see that many snaps. Now, maybe this is a hedge for, if a TJ Hawkinson extension doesn't get done, right? We think this guy has more potential to go into the future. But I think if you wanted a blocking tight end too, like a guy like Chris Manhertz on, who's a lot older, right? It's not an apples to apples comparison at all, but like the value of a blocking tight end is like a couple $1,000,000 at most to me. So obviously, I think the Vikings see more in him as a receiver than that, but I still think as a tight end too, like I just don't see where the value in this contract is. I think the player's good and he's an ascending player and he's the potential to be more, but I just don't love the contract for him, Nick. I don't know how you feel about it.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I didn't love it at first, especially when you consider, I mean, he's getting top 20 money at the
Yeah.
position, and the Vikings are already paying TJ Hawkinson his 5th year option, and they're about to extend him for probably $15+ million a year. So that's a lot of money to invest in tight end. Clearly, Kwesi thinks there's some arbitrage opportunity here where, we talked
Hmm.
about how wide receiver twos are getting paid $20 million or more, whereas tight end ones are getting paid not even 3/4 of that. So there's. But at the same time, this isn't a TJ Hawkinson that you're signing. This is a guy who came out of college not as a good blocker and like only put it together last year. So you're kind of, I don't want to call him a one-hit wonder because he is a good blocker and he opened up a lot of things for Lamar Jackson last year. And all the crazy running things they do in Baltimore. But you're not necessarily guaranteed to get PFF's highest graded run blocker next year as well. I will say though. Coming out as the highest graded run blocker or second highest graded, depending on which snap threshold you're using. Um, that wasn't funny production, he was doing that as an inline Y tight end. So, you can kind of. PFF grades are always a little funny because they don't tell you who you're matched up against. When you're matched up in line primarily, that means you're taking on defensive ends. You're
Hmm.
you're setting the edge. You're kicking guys out. You're not picking on cornerbacks or safeties or even linebackers. You're doing a lot of dirty work as an inline tight end. So that much is exciting. I it still seems like too much money to me. I will say there's potential for him to be when Oliver, when he was coming out, like he was talked about as somebody who had like, yeah, he's not going to be like the biggest seam stretcher, like a Vernon Davis type, but he's got, he ran a fast 40 for his size. And he's got good athleticism. So I feel like there's potential for him to blossom into more of a receiver than he is. Um, Obviously Baltimore is not the best place for, getting tons of targets necessarily and being able to show off that skill set. So I feel like this is another candidate where you could see him becoming a better player in Minnesota than he was previously. And I feel like that's the theme to all these guys they've mentioned is these are younger guys with potential to play a little bit better on the Vikings than they did on their previous teams. And I do feel like the only way this makes sense is if you see him as a starter on your offense playing a significant amount of snaps. Obviously, you're not going to have Oliver out there on, probably not have him out there on third and long, because you're not going to, you're probably going to want, Rager or whoever else, your third wide receiver out there who can get to the sticks a little bit faster than your tight end. When you already have TJ Hawkinson as your one tight end. But I feel like they're probably going to base out of 12 personnel for this to make sense. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to pay a guy $7 million a year and have him out on your bench for the majority of snaps. And when you're basing out of 12 personnel, you're going to see a lot more heavier personnel. You're going to see more base personnel, more three linebackers, and I feel like the meta right now in the NFL is shifting towards a lot more odd fronts. You're seeing
Mm-hmm.
everybody running tons of bear teams. Teams are now like basing out of bear fronts, which is crazy because it used to be like a specialty sub package, and now it's like they play most of their snaps with like five defensive linemen out there. And I feel like when you have a tight end who's capable of taking on those defensive ends on the edge, you can definitely exploit that in the run game. And so I feel like there's some. I have a lot of trust in Kevin O'Connell and Wes Phillips from like just where is the league going and where do we need to tweak things and where is there going to be an advantage. So I feel like I defer to them a little bit on the long term strategy of what a blocking tight end does for you, and also feel like when you're facing bear fronts or odd fronts or you're facing three linebackers out there, Oliver's a matchup mismatch. That you want him lined up against linebacker because that's going to be advantage Oliver because he's an athletic tight end too. So for your fourth option in the receiving game, there are ways to approach this and be like, okay, I can see where they're coming from. At the same time, though, compared to Davenport, who I really like, compared to Byron Murphy, who both of us are raving over, this one's a little bit more puzzling. So I don't like it. I don't like the contract numbers, even though there's funny money in there. That said, this is one of those weird things where it's like, okay, they're going to become a 12 personnel team. That changes a lot of things. That changes the run game. That changes probably the efficiency of the run game because there was, I think, a lot of the skill positions were a problem in run blocking last year. So you hope for a more efficient running game. You hope for a more efficient passing game because of the matchups. And you hope that being much more multiple allows them to do a lot more things, build in more play action. It kind of opens up the passing game as well. So, from an overall strategy perspective, it's really interesting. From the individual player you're getting and the contract you're paying him, I think this looks like an overpay, but because you can't judge them independently of each other, I feel
Yeah.
like I have to like grade this as an incomplete until I see the master plan. So,
Yeah.
but it's certainly an interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, even if we're down on this signing, particularly compared to the other two signings a little bit, like if you're really excited about Josh Oliver, I can see that, right? Like it's really exciting in terms of his ability as a blocker last year. He's still got the receiving ability. He can, if we're going to transform our offense and run a ton of 12 personnel, he can be an important piece to that. And I think the one thing you said there, which I want to resonate in terms of all of the Viking signings so far, well, we're going to get to Dean Lowry, but these three major signings of players the Vikings clearly targeted and wanting on their teams have a theme, especially when you compare them to the players that we've lost, right? We've got Adam Thielen, we've got Eric Kendricks, we've got Dalvin Tomlinson, we've got Patrick Peterson. All of those guys are 30 or quickly approaching 30, right? Josh Oliver, Marcus Davenport, Byron Murphy, I think all are 25 or 26 years old, right? So the Vikings are trying to sign younger players on an upswing and hope those guys continue their development arc and outplay the contracts that they're getting. and they're all short-term commitments that will give the Vikings a lot of flexibility. Like, the Vikings could move on from all three. Well, Davenport obviously would be a free agent regardless, but they can move on from all three of these players next season, saving money against the cap if they cut them, right? Josh Oliver would save a couple $1,000,000. Byron Murphy would save, Byron Murphy only has that $3 million in dead cap. He'd save like $9 million if they moved on from him. So betting on young players who you think can ascend to, and I think the multiple year contract structure for Murphy and Oliver is smart in that sense. If they do ascend, you've got them for steals, right? If they do become transcendent players at their position. So I really like it from that team building perspective. The specific choice to choose Oliver and pay him the amount they did, I'm not a huge fan of, but we can move past that, especially because we like the other couple of signings. The final signing here is somewhat recent news. Dean Lowry signed today for 2 years, $8.5 million. I believe I saw in the range of $3.5 million guaranteed. If you can take it, Nick.
Yeah, $3 million guaranteed, 2 years, $8.5 million. I think Dean Lowry, we're familiar from him from all the border battles with the Packers. I think of him as a souped up James Lynch, if that's a player comparison I can make. He's a very natural fit as a 3-4 defensive end. He's got heavy hands. He can win with power. He sets a strong edge when he plays on the edge, but I think of him more as like a 4-eye or even some 3 technique a little bit. So I feel like he's your Dalvin Tomlinson replacement in much of a similar way that Harrison Phillips was your Michael Pierce replacement. You got somebody who was younger, not as good, but cheaper and healthier. I feel like Dean Lowry is a little bit that too. He's not that much younger than Dalvin Tomlinson, and he's also Harrison Phillips. Michael Pierce to Harrison Phillips is a much smaller downgrade, I think, than Dalvin Tomlinson to Dean Lowry. But still, I mean, after they let Tomlinson walk, and he got $15 million a year, they had to do something because you don't want on your base defense, you don't want James Lynch out there as a bona fide starter. I thought James Lynch had some good reps last year, but he still was pretty inconsistent. I think Dean Lowry is he's maybe consistent isn't the best word to use with him because he's coming off a bit of a down year last year with the Packers, but he will fill his gap in the run game and he does his job. There's some just a guy potential, but I think that's fine because the contract they're paying him is kind of a just a guy contract. So, and I do think he brings a lot more pass rush juice compared to at least Harrison Phillips and Kyrie's Tonga. So I think he'll be out there as your one designated big guy when you got your pass rush sets, and the other three are Smith, Hunter, and Davenport, or if Hunter or if Zadarius Smith isn't there, maybe it's Wanham, but he's your fourth pass rusher on pass rush downs. Gives you a little bit more pass rush juice. He's more of a bull rusher than he is, going to necessarily win with finesse. But he's a solid player. I mean, I feel like this is a good move because now they're not hamstrung into doing something to save the defensive line right now. Because after they let Tomlinson walk, I don't necessarily think you can go into next season with just Tonga and Phillips, who are both really good players, but they're both kind of pure nose guard. Run pluggers, and especially with the Flores team, you need guys who can pass rush a little bit more. So I think this one he's not like a sexy, exciting player, but he fills a need, and it's a reasonable contract.
Yeah, and I think with Lowry, he has he's not a great player, right? And I don't think he's a great pass rusher. He had one very good pass rush year in 2021. Where he ended up with 5 sacks and 40 plus pressures. That's the only season of his career, really, that he was a significant force as a pass rusher, right? I think he has one other season with over half of that amount of pressures. He's got 29 pressures in one season, and he's been a starter for 7 seasons. Justice Mosqueda, who's a Packers fan, I trust his analysis a lot on the NFL at large, and particularly pass rushers, to be honest. Always thought that Lowry was underrated, and then thought he had a terrible 2022. So that matters quite a bit to me as well.
I'm sorry, this is what happens when we go for a marathon 2-hour podcast, Matt. It's oh man.
Yeah, I'm struggling
shout out
here.
To the listeners who are still with us, man. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy giving Chris Rumpf whoever he wants as, like a ball of clay, because I feel like everybody Chris Rumpf touches turns into, if not gold, a better version of themselves. So, I mean, Dean Lowry, he's not in the mold of a 25-year-old on the upswing kind of guy. He's kind of the opposite. He's not old, but he's 28, which in NFL terms is, prime or starting to be past your prime. So, but like I said, he fills a need, and this prevents you from feeling like you have to draft an interior defensive lineman or you have to do something else. And this is, if they are going to let Tomlinson walk, I feel like this is a downgrade, but this is a palatable downgrade as opposed to like being terrified that you're going to have Jonathan Bullard or James Lynch or whoever else out there for 500 snaps on the year. So I think it fills a need, and from that sense, I'm on board.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I think it ends up filling a need that the Vikings very clearly had with the departure of Dalvin Tomlinson. So you've got somebody in the rotation there who's been a competent starter. I mean, I don't expect great things from him. I think, he's probably going to be on the downswing of his career, but, you at some point you need bodies there who can play. And Lowry is somebody who's played fine for quite a while with the Packers. So with that being said, I think we're pretty much ready to wrap it up here. Nick, you got anything else to add before we get out of here?
Do you feel like the Vikings right now have a better roster than they did last year? Because they've done so much shedding of veterans, and it's interesting. Like as much as we're excited about Byron Murphy, Marcus Davenport, the other guys they've added, do you feel like that offsets losing Kendricks, losing Patrick Peterson, losing Tomlinson, losing Thielen? It's
I think as until we see how the corner room shakes out, I don't think I'm ready to say that this is better at all. I mean, we've got one player who I'm confident in starting right now. I like Booth and Evans, but I'm not confident in either. And also we got worse in the receiver room, right? So I think with the loss of Thielen. So I would say right now, no, but we've still got the draft. We've still got the remainder of free agency. I doubt the Vikings are completely done making signings in the free agency period. Like I imagine we'll see at least one or two more significant players get signed. So it's incomplete. I would say we're worse now, but from a roster health standpoint, the roster is probably healthier based on the youth and the contracts that we have at the same time.
Yeah, I feel like they're doing a good job. This feels like a competitive rebuild, Like this feels like
Yes.
they're shedding bloated contracts, but they're not giving up on 2023. They're still signing
Mm-hmm.
really good players for short deals who have the potential to work out and be part of the long-term plan. So I'm really excited. I think this team has a much brighter future for like 2024 and beyond after everything they've done. For 2023, I feel like the 2023 roster probably will not be an upgrade to the 2022 roster where it stood
Mm-hmm.
on September 1st, but it's still a long ways to go. And a lot of these guys, they have the potential, I feel like, to have very impressive best case scenarios. Like if Josh Oliver comes in, and all of a sudden we're running 12 personnel like the Eagles do, and that opens up things for the run game, you can see him being like a very, very important glue guy for the offense. Byron Murphy comes in and he's shadowing number one cornerbacks and comes out and has a Pro Bowl season, which we both agree he has the potential to do. You're talking about a significantly better defense, at least, or a significantly better cornerback room than last year. So a lot of potential here for upside, but we kind of have to see how it all kind of comes together. So
Yeah, the Vikings have done a great job, I think, of adding talent to their roster, adding talent who can be productive for a long time for them if they get those players, while simultaneously leaving 2024 pretty untouched. I mean, obviously we had to move Kirk's money there. Obviously some of the contracts we signed have bigger cap hits in 2024, but 2024 is still pretty clean. I think we still have like $75 million or something like that in cap space projected for 2024. So I think they've done a really good job straddling adding talent to the roster without leveraging a lot of money into the future, which I think is a really kind of masterful job by Kwesi and the team there. So with that, I think we're done for today. I'm Matt Freese. You can find me at Fries Football. He is Nick Olson. You can find him at Nick Olson NFL. Greg Blake is at You've Been Gregged. We are Kindred Skulls. You can find us at Kindred Skulls on Twitter. We're available on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We also post to YouTube. And with that, Skull Vikings.
Doodles. Goal, baby.
Another first-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind, and we'll score the